So before we start, I've been remiss. I want to say thank you so much to our sponsors for today's events, Permobile, Hayek Medical, and the Ability Center. Their financial support made this event possible, so let's give them a round of applause. So be sure to stop by their tables and see their products. And all of these things really are, they are part of our partnership in this community and across the country to give people adaptive tools to keep living a good life with ALS. So thank you guys for your support and for being here. So we have a microphone here in the audience. So what we'd like to do is be able to give you an opportunity to ask our panelists questions. Please hold for the microphone, and then we're going to make sure that we recap the question before you guys answer. So we'll get started, but I want to lead off with a question for the panel, and perhaps Jill and Dr. Beckman, you can respond to this, is what sort of time frame does it take to take an interesting idea from the lab bench to finding a treatment that's available in a clinic? And these microphones work, you just have to turn it on. There you go. So
hello? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know, I don't ever like to give an exact timeline, but it takes years. I worked, and Dr. Beckman's worked for almost, how long? 25 years at least. And so I worked through a postdoc, and things unfortunately are slow. Things take time. But I would say it would take at least a decade from like an idea that you have to go through multiple experiments to then get a drug and then take it all the way through clinical trials. Do you have a more exact answer than me?
No, but a decade is very real. And it doesn't matter how hard you bang your head against the wall. It's going to take longer than you think. And there are more obstacles than you can imagine along the way. So like one of the nice things about copper ATSM, it's already been 12 years. And we're just at phase 1 trials. So if it's a new drug, it's a long road. It's also called the road, the valley of death that you're going through.
Phase 2. Yeah.
Well before phase 2.
Phase
There's
2,
thousands of deaths well before phase 2.
True.
And the phase 3 is in ALS is what's killed lots and lots of drugs.
Great.
If I could just
Sure.
If I could just quickly add, there's a website called ALS Untangled by Dr. Richard Bedlack out of Duke, alsuntangled.com, and what he does is, so there's a lot of, obviously, quackery out there when it comes to ALS therapeutics, people getting stem cell therapies overseas, stuff like that, so there are certainly dangers as well. And so what his website does is he tries to kind of like, debunk some of the mysteries out there when it comes to like, looking at certain compounds or whatever it may be for patients who want to go ahead and try something. So I think it's important, to kind of maybe visit the website to see exactly, and it's one of those ones where it's patients, it's caregivers who also provide input to the website itself. So it's a really good resource.
Great. Questions from the audience? Cassie, over here.
Thank you. I think it is very interesting. I asked a question about the clinical trials. Is it possible for people outside of the U.S. to participate in any of them? I'm talking on behalf of my relatives in Norway.
Go ahead.
So we have clinical trials going on in the United States, but there are also clinical trials happening all over the world, not just the United States. Do you have a good resource to get them European? Is there a European database that you know about to search for them?
Here,
we have to.
Both those microphones work.
Yeah.
So turn that one on.
There are European resources out there. I believe the ENCALS group, ENCALS, as well as ALS-MNDA.
Yeah, MSNDA.
Those guys are international based, and they may have more information about trials which are happening in Europe. It probably is not very. Patients who are overseas, if they meet the eligibility requirements, I don't believe they're going to be asking you if you come to the United States, as long as you meet the eligibility for a clinical trial, to go ahead and be in a clinical trial. I guess it's always access to care, coming in from overseas to go ahead and, join a clinical trial and so forth, and finding a facility which actually is doing a clinical trial as well. So the resources that Jill mentioned with the ALS Association, the website itself to look for potential clinical trials. And then you can always call and ask, hey, my brother's overseas, can he join this clinical trial? That's certainly something you can always do. Just pick up the phone and call the clinical coordinator there to figure out exactly what the eligibility requirements are.
So I believe that the NIH Clinical Trials website, which is the registry of all clinical trials that have any NIH funding, they also list any trials, so people actually do enroll there or put their trial up. So like the copper ATSM is being done in Australia, but it was listed or posted immediately on the NIH site. But there were only 50 slots available, and I think they had something like 2,000 applicants.
Yeah. Same thing as clinicaltrials.gov. That's another resource, but it's not as easy to understand as the NEAL site. So I always like to mention the NEAL site. Okay.
So, yeah, so everybody, there's actually a huge amount of money that's spent on alternative therapies, and ALS patients do research it. There's actually a large amount out there. So Lou Gehrig was actually treated with an experimental treatment, and he got massive injections of vitamin E every day. And it didn't work. The clinicians, probably the consensus is vitamin E doesn't work. I think it actually does. And it works best if you take it before you get the disease, okay? Because it takes years for it to build up in the brain. But that's, a hypothesis.
And that's only one. I mean, there are many others.
Right, and in fact, there's a large literature. I've actually had a fair amount of funding, and I've tested lots of different compounds. But it turns out Edaravon is an antioxidant. And the way it's described, it's like every other antioxidant. So the key thing that I was trying to get across, Edaravon is radicava. Just they can charge a lot more money with a new name, it seems.
So it's donating electrons, right?
Yeah, and then when it donates one electron, it breaks down in a way that's non-toxic, okay? But it turns out it does it in a very unique way, and it has properties that lets it get across the blood-brain barrier. And so a lot of antioxidants, the natural ones, they will work. You can get them into muscle, but not into the brain or into the spinal cord, okay? But there actually is a huge literature. There's a huge number of things that have been tried. And the one suggestion I have, and this is, I'm not a physician, but it seems to me a lot of people develop ALS and they try to go on a pure diet and, and that's usually driven by a heart-healthy diet. And it turns out a diet that's heavy in fatty acids and lipids actually works better, and there's European trials on it. It works in the mice. So what's the best diet for an ALS patient may not be what's best for preventing heart disease. And so there's a lot of things like that that need to be collected. And then there's hardly any data consistent available, and that's where the registry is so important. These lifestyle factors, that finally there's a read on the environmental factors and other things. So we still have a lot to learn.
There's also,
Talking about fatty acids, taking omega-3s.
Well, it's not just omega-3s, which are actually very important in the brain because your brain uses a lot of fatty acids that you have to have in the diet, fish oils and things like that. But it's actually the metabolism of glucose and proteins is really disrupted in ALS. So you find people are wasting away, yet they're eating an enormous number of calories. But it turns out they can still process fats and get calories out of that. And that was the theory behind the European studies.
And one more quick thing, anything about acupuncture, has that been studied?
So actually, the website by Richard Bedlow would be a great place to
Yeah,
look
sounds
for information like that, as well as cannabinoids.
yeah, ALS Untangled, the one I mentioned, that certainly would have information about probably vitamin E as well as all this stuff. But just to kind of circle back, I mean, this is all regarding inflammation. When you have inflammation in the body, it actually generates free radicals, and that by itself is a disease process which occurs, whether it's decades and so forth, which may lead to a certain condition such as ALS. So it kind of all circles back, and whether it's inflammation in the gut and the microbiome there, or other parts of the body, inflammation and heart disease, starts off, where you have inflammation in your blood vessels, and that by itself leads to actually atherosclerosis and then clogs in your vessels, leading to a heart attack. So it always circles back to almost inflammation in the body itself. So, but the resources ALS Untangled certainly can go ahead and provide more information about acupuncture, as well as I think you mentioned cannabinoids as well. So.
Yeah, Dr. Bedlack has put together.
turned it off.
Dr. Bedlack has put together. I don't know how many reviews. Probably almost 30.
I think 30.
Yeah. And it's a really great resource for any alternative treatment. He has a whole team that's really breaks it down to understand, and he rates it. He actually gives it a grade, A through D. If it's a D, you do not take it, to understand whether you should be looking at those or not. And Patients Like Me is also a good resource.
They're also looking at, I guess, L-serine as well in certain areas too, where they're giving patients L-serine. But there's also another study which is also going on, which is the HERV-K. The HERV-K is actually a retrovirus they discovered, which potentially may cause ALS. And so there's a clinical trials going on where they're giving patients antiretroviral similar to HIV patients, and seeing if that's going to potentially help out when it comes to with this particular virus called the HERV virus, HERV, and it's a possible link to ALS as well. So.
Thank you. I have two parts to my question. One is, internationally, where can we find out what's going on? Because when my husband got diagnosed, I found just online about the Radicava in Japan, and then I found the ALS Society, but it was so exciting to find thing happening somewhere else. Excuse me.
So the ALS Association is based in the United States, but we really try hard to cover things that are exciting that are happening in Europe. We have a website on our through the ALS Association. It's alsa.org/Radicava, which is a great resource, a great starting point. It has a lot of fact sheets and webinars that we did with MT Pharma America, which is the company that put out Radicava. And the MT Pharma's website is also a really good resource for information for that. But we try really hard to cover things like mastitinib, which is happening over in Spain, and copper ATSM in Australia. We are tracking that. And so when big news comes out, we really try hard to get information out through our blog and through our website and social media.
I can also share that similar to what we're doing here today in terms of like a webcast, their efforts are like this online are happening with many scientific meetings. The Motor Neuron Disease Association of the United States, in alliance with the International Alliance of Motor Neuron Disease Associations, holds an international meeting every year that circles the globe. And it has both a basic science research track and a clinical management research track. Every year at that event, they have a patient and person with ALS motor neuron disease education day that they webcast. And that's coming up this December in Boston, Massachusetts this year. And so there are many of those things that we also make available through our website, through our newsletters, email blasts, but also the ALS Association, and Jill does a lot of this work herself, maintains a blog where we keep up-to-date posts with some of these activities that are happening.
And then the NDA meeting that's happening that you just said in Boston, it's the beginning of December, and we live tweet from that event to really try to put a person who can't travel to Boston to give some updates as we're there. I do the best I can because there's a lot of information.
Thank you. I had another question relating to the international scope of the research. And I mean, if you think about Europe, you think about Australia, North America, I mean, you have certain consistencies in lifestyles as well as other kinds of environmental factors. I was wondering what kinds of exchanges, research, data is coming from parts of the world where you might have very different kinds of environmental conditions or other kinds of factors. I was thinking of Japan, China, I mean, South America came up, I know, with some study. But I'm wondering
So the question is around the scope and breadth of how much international research is occurring.
So I know ALS Association certainly funds research internationally as well. And I think, you guys fund the best research out there and the most potentially efficacious research for ALS. So whether it's domestic or international, I don't believe you guys make some sort of distinction there because you guys have very esteemed individuals.
Who's ever the best?
Yeah, exactly. And so the premise is, but just to quickly, you mentioned, we know internationally the epidemiology is different for certain parts of Europe compared to certain other parts of the world. The African American population, for whatever reason, doesn't get ALS as higher rates. So other northern parts of Europe get ALS at higher rates as well compared to the US. It may be a situation of being much more homogeneous as opposed to being much more heterogeneous. So it's really hard to say, but there is variability in epidemiology when it comes to incidence and prevalence in Europe when you look at the United States or other parts of the world as well. So, and I mean, that could be, one of those things where is it possible gene-environment interaction? We're not sure, and so forth. Another thing, I mean, there's always a hypothesis about lack of vitamin D. I'm just throwing something out there where lack of vitamin D in certain northern populations could be a contributing factor for other host diseases. It could be, there's something called seasonal depression where individuals living in northern latitudes, because of lack of sun, they have a higher rate of depression as well. But the premise is there's so many, like I mentioned, unknowns about what exactly is happening about ALS. So certainly, but not just ALS, other conditions as well.
And there is a huge research program on ALS in Japan, as well as in China, and they're at these international meetings. So it's more a matter of we just didn't really mention it, but a lot of thought goes back and forth. And we had one of these motor neuron meetings in Japan a while ago. I really am impressed with how they manage the care of ALS patients, particularly in the terminal ages, and they have facilities where they bring in not only the patients, but the family. And so there's a lot to be learned from these people on not just life factors, what causes the diseases, but how we manage it.
And another important point is Brainstorm, which is an Israeli company, actually is doing stem cell therapy or getting the clinical trials for stem cell therapy in place. And there's certain locations, Jill, you probably know more about that, regarding Brainstorm's stem cell therapy coming out. So, but I mean, the international, countries and partners and institutions, I mean, they're certainly also at the forefront of looking at ALS.
Yeah, the Brainstorms trial, it's going to be starting, I think, hopefully soon. I think right now they've only announced 4 sites in the United States, and with maybe a maximum 6. Okay. But
do you know where those sites are then?
Not off the top of my head. I know at least one's in Boston.
Yeah, Mass General, I believe.
But I can get back to you. I can look that up for you easily. And want to let you know that the International Alliance meeting, which is right before the ALS MND meeting, which is the big research meeting, is all our ALS associations all over the world come together, from China, Japan, Europe, South America, all come together for a few days to really come and collaborate. It's a really great event, and I always enjoyed meeting people from all over the world who really are dedicated, just like us, to finding a cure for ALS and giving the best they can for patients and their families.
Yeah, I was interested. First of all, thank you all for your presentations. It's fascinating. I understand that there's great difficulty in trying to understand what causes the disease, but I'm also given to understand that about 9% of ALS patients have a hereditary or familiar factor that plays into them getting. In other words, it's hereditary in nature. My question is A, is that true? And B, if so, what is the significance to the ALS patient in terms of how they might approach their therapies and so forth in terms of dealing with it?
Sure. So, I believe.
Sorry, real fast. The question, just trying to restate for our web audience, the question is about familial ALS genetics and strategies for ascertaining familial ALS and treating it.
Sure. So, actually, you said 90%. 90% of ALS is, apologies. So, yeah, exactly. About 10% of ALS is considered familial, which is related to genetics itself. That's where the antisense clinical trials certainly are very important to go ahead and look at SOD1, C9, and so forth. But they're also discovering certain SOD, or as well as certain genetic traits in people who've got sporadic ALS as well. So just because you've got the gene, as in terms of with the familial ALS, but they're also discovering these genes as well as in the sporadic ALS patients as well. So.
Yeah, and I just want to add that now with genome sequencing and the technology's gotten so good that, and much less expensive. Before you could probably tell me like tens of thousands of dollars, and now it's about $2,000, I think, to get your genome sequenced, which means you sequence all your DNA. And so genetic discovery has really been accelerated, and I think a lot of cases that we are calling sporadic ALS, meaning we don't know what it causes it, that it may be a really rare genetic mutation that we just haven't found yet too. So there's that also.
As they discover more genes connected to ALS, does that mean there's more connection to familial ALS?
Yeah, I would say that they'd really move into the category of familial ALS. And with that, though, you have to understand is that the more genes we discover, they really represent more therapeutic targets. And we can really then understand maybe they would discover a new disease pathway we didn't know before that could maybe even be related to a person without familial ALS, like another inflammation pathway we didn't know about or something else. So any type of discovery is a good thing. Is it good?
So would it be advisable for an ALS patient to find that out? Find out if they're in one of that 90% group?
That's a personal choice. And, we always recommend that you talk to your doctor and not genetic counselors. We don't like to recommend that, so. Okay.
So I just wanted to answer a little bit more. So maybe 10%, there's a known genetic factor you can see in inheritance. There's also about 30% of cases where there's a higher prevalence within a family. And the numbers in this they're really hard to lay down accurately, and that's where the registry is so important.
Yeah.
But it does mean that if you have ALS in your family, there are things that you might think about doing more proactively. And the reason I bring up things like vitamin E is there's actually a lot of studies that it is prospectively useful in preventing the incidence of disease. And that's something that you could do, and small things like that. The other part of it is, the idea if you go out and get genetic testing, there's a real question of, what are you going to do with the information, because we can't do anything about it. But I'll tell you, the absolute toughest question I've ever got in my life in any presentation, I've been involved in some real debates, was at one of these sessions where a woman got up and said, my husband here has the A4V mutation. I know there's nothing you can do for him. But the 3 kids running around with a microphone, is there anything you can do for them? And that's really what I'm hopeful that we actually may be able to do something in the not too distant future, where you can look and even have a prophylactic or try to prevent the disease in the future. I think we have ideas now of how you could go about doing it, and that's where the research and tracking is so important.
Dr. Beckman, you had on several of your slides the formulation, chemical formulation of the bark, showing the formation of free radical, which then becomes nitrated, which then makes the toxic compound. And I'm wondering if it is known, or whether you have a hypothesis about whether that reaction is driven at all by the amount of available nitrite or nitrate. And if so, could nitrates or nitrites in the foods make a difference? And could medications such as nitroglycerin also have an effect?
So it's a great question. One of the great sources of nitrates in the diet are lettuce, and so my kids use that against me for why they shouldn't eat their salad. But the fact is that nitrites are metabolized and they won't get into the brain in a significant level. The brain produces a lot of nitric oxide. It's a key element for signaling, for learning, for development, but it can get subverted into a pathologic process. So I don't think it's so much the dietary path, but it is a target to look at. And people they've not been very successful, but I tend to be pretty boneheaded and said they haven't looked in the right way yet, and it's still a pathway to look at in the future. But I wouldn't worry about things in the diet like that. of nitrites actually causing the disease or amplifying it. We really don't see any evidence of that except in the gut.
I think that's a question you should pose to your primary care physician and ask them to see if they can provide testing as well as a genetic counselor as well. That's something that should be discussed certainly with your physician to go ahead and there is testing available, and the premise is just to more or less talk to your physician to see how you can go about doing that and explain to him or her your family history of ALS and why it's important to go ahead and be tested.
I just confirm with Dr. Beckman. So with FTD, two genes that are associated with it that we do know about are the C9orf72 gene and the TDP43 gene. So if something you do want to get tested for, that's probably the two genes that they would look for. But that's not saying that there's something else that we don't know about, another gene that's connected.
Testing would come through the neurologist's office,
Yeah.
as well as the multi-disc clinic.
So I'll try to answer as best I can, but none of us are physicians, and these are getting way beyond our realm.
Yeah.
Okay, but it's the same test that we talked about. There are good physicians here, both at OHSU and Providence, who would have better ideas of where to go look for these. But the other thing possibly is, as a family, to consider being part of one of these registries, or if a family can happen. So for example, I mentioned that there was a study that came out in '93 that changed my research. There was one woman who lives in the family with A4V SOD mutations who organized her family across the country, and that was pivotal, being able to pick out and see SOD was really involved in the disease. So there are people that are searching for genetic causes, and families where people are still living, and even providing in a repository may not be able to help or identify anything for you, but it may give someone a clue later on as to what the connections are.
Just as a physician, I strongly would recommend, if you're concerned obviously, to go ahead and have your brother speak with a neurologist and go ahead and get tested. And then the resources of the ALS Association's local chapter, they certainly can go ahead and help out as well, as in terms of providing additional information. But that's something I think you certainly should do if it's not already been done before. It looks like it's not been done before for your brother as well as your family. But that's certainly something that I would advise as a physician to talk to his neurologist as well as a genetic counselor to figure out exactly what can be done. But that's certainly something that should be initiated at neurologists and or the primary care physicians and to go ahead and get pre-approval to get those tests done, because obviously, if you have two brothers, one who's passed away, one who currently has ALS FTD, and you're concerned, that certainly should be brought up to the provider and seriously considered, for testing. That's what I would do, and I think Lance probably could provide resources as well. There are multidisciplinary clinics. I'm sure your brother's probably going to one of the bigger MDCs here in the area. So I think okay. And so certainly I think that's something that the association here could go ahead and put you in touch with individuals potentially that could go ahead and help you out as well.
Yeah, genetic testing, it's been mentioned many times, talking to a genetic counselor about what you would do with that information and how it might affect people's lives, not just yours, but other generations and other people in your family. It's important for a family to go through that process. And then there's also a very important process, which we deal a lot with, is how these types of testing gets paid for by insurance. And there are strategies to do this, but sometimes it really depends. It's on a case-by-case basis on how these things are covered.
Just to quickly mention, so typically it's autosomal dominant, which means it's a 50-50 chance. Just because you have the gene potentially does not mean you will get the disease. So just to kind of keep that in mind as well, it's a 50-50 being an autosomal dominant condition. So that's also important too.
I have a question here from Jill. She says, I noticed that trials say by invitation only. What does that mean and how does one get invited?
I think that's something, every clinical trial will have eligibility requirements as in terms of for the patient themselves, but that's certainly where, you can go ahead and call and ask exactly what sort of eligibility requirements they have. Most likely they'll go ahead and list them on the website itself, whether it's clinicaltrials.gov or wherever it may be, the NEAL's website. But I think it's important to go ahead and reach out. From what I've heard, when it comes to clinical trials with ALS, there are trials out there, but the participation rate is very, very low. So I think that certainly has got to be improved and increased as well. So for clinical trials, I think it's important to be active as well as aggressive in calling these institutions and seeing, hey, am I eligible? And then if they say no, then ask, do you know about some other clinical trial that's happening out there as well?
And just to add, that's a great question. I agree with Paul that you have to, get that information and really try to enroll if you can. And just to give you an example of an invitation-only trial, I told you in my presentation was the Vigor ALS trial. It's the continuation of the tirasemtiv cytokinetics trial. So what that is, it's if you were on that tirasemtiv in the phase 3 trial, this invitation-only trial allows you to, the only people who are in that original phase 3 trial then continue that trial in open access. So that's what that, so a lot of times those invitation-only trials are like a continuation study, if you're only on it before.
Thanks. To continue the familial thread, would it be helpful, I have my fourth family member now diagnosed, would it be helpful for me to try to contact as many as I could and get them to be on the registry? Is that what you're recommending? Because I felt helpless. The second question is, if you do the testing, will insurance companies hold that against you in the future for your health?
So I certainly would encourage anyone with ALS who's not joined to go ahead and join the registry and and opt in to get notifications about clinical trials that we help recruit for. Go ahead and participate in the biorepository as well. I certainly would go ahead and encourage that. Regarding your question, what do you think?
I honestly don't know. I think I don't want to say either way about the insurance companies. I personally hope not that they don't do that, but I can't say for sure. I'm sorry. We can find out though.
I mean, there is, I believe, some legislation, if not already passed, some sort of, isn't there an act by Congress which says something to the effect that you cannot discriminate against somebody with a genetic condition? I thought there was already an act passed by that you cannot.
That's part of Obamacare.
Yeah, it's part of
existing conditions.
It's part of the ACA, exactly. It's
Yeah.
part of the ACA with pre-existing conditions. You cannot be, hey, just because you have this, you cannot be denied care for that. So that's always like an iffy situation because you've got these companies out there, whether it's Ancestry.com or 23andMe, which may give you some sort of indication that hey, you could be more apt to get this condition or that condition. But I don't believe, or I've not heard currently of any sort of, discrimination about getting tested genetically and then not being able to apply for a job or being denied for coverage elsewhere. That certainly, hopefully, should never happen, and hopefully it will not happen.
Could I expand on the question, I guess? So if I understand what you asked, is if you enrolled in the ALS registry, is there any way an insurance company can find out? I think you're completely protected that way. There's no way they'll know.
Absolutely not. We did not disclose any information. Whatever we disclose is de-identified. We have very, very strict IRB, which is Institutional Review Board, where we cannot, or even the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, where we cannot report anything to anybody which could potentially go ahead and release their information when it comes to ALS by itself. We do not disclose no names, nothing like that at all. What you would disclose to researchers would be a demographic file, but it would be de-identified. So it would be age groups as opposed to a specific age.
And you do ask for a social security number, but I remember it's just because you don't want two palmettos in the registry.
The SS number, so we don't ask for the full SS number, it's just the last 5, and that's just for us to match up against Medicare data. It just makes it easier to make sure the person we're counting is a unique person and not somebody who's a duplicate. So.
Yeah, remember the answer that before.
Thank you for all your information. We were looking at clinical trials, and my husband was excluded from most of them because he was on an AVAPS, actually, even before he was diagnosed. And I was wondering why an AVAPS, in your client with an AVAPS, would exclude you from a clinical study when I wouldn't think that would be affecting any part of what the study would do.
Yeah, I mean, it's because at CDC we don't do clinical trials ourselves. That really is a question when it comes to the company who's actually sponsoring the clinical trial, and to ask them, why am I being excluded for this particular reason, and have them provide an answer for you. I can't speak on behalf of institutions that we help because we don't. There's no stamp of approval that we do, or even I think the association does for clinical trials. We help facilitate clinical trials, but the actual eligibility is based upon the institution or the sponsoring company itself.
So I guess you could say your question is the $100 million question, quite literally. So imagine yourself that you're a drug company executive trying to make a decision about going after the disease. And so what they try to do is pick out patients that are most likely to be respond to the treatment or show success, even if it means excluding a lot of people. In the COPR-ATSM studies, there's all sorts of things on the web of, well, basically you assholes, because of, they're excluded for paradoxical reasons. They were diagnosed way before anybody else, and so they're excluded. But what they're trying to do is figure out what's the best chance that they could get their drug approved. And this has been one of the paradoxes of, like with the COPR-ATSM, my mouse data would say, you should try to treat the A4V mutations, the most severe form of the disease, with it. And the drug company is saying, no, we don't want to do that. Why should I go treat the most severe form of the patient disease? I want to try something that's milder. And Radicava was one example where they had to go back and pick out early people under very specific conditions to show there was a benefit in a subgroup to be able to get the drug approved. So that's the reason why there's all this careful sorting. And clinical trials are basically the epitome of a committee designing a racehorse, and you end up with a camel that may not even be alive in the end.
Yeah, and this is not just for ALS, it's for a host of other sorts of clinical trials out there across the spectrum. Like what Dr. Beckman is saying, I mean, a lot of these institutions, these companies are looking for someone who's potentially young, newly diagnosed, so they have a better outcome at the end. But it's not just for ALS, it's for a lot of other conditions out there.
Hi, thanks again for all your information. Two questions, one regarding my sister, and another question for you, Joe. She recently was tested and found that she had elevated levels off the charts of petroleum, lead, and mercury in her body. And then weeks later, she was tested for ALS and found by two different neurologists that she did have ALS. Has there been any research to show correlation between high levels of metals and ALS? And then my second question is for Joe. My mom passed away from ALS about 7 years ago. My sister has it. How much vitamin E should I be taking?
I was hoping you were going to answer,
Yeah,
but
let me go ahead and answer
I'll
the
come
first part of your question. There are a lot of things out there, whether it's heavy metals, pesticides, and so forth. If there's any sort of correlation or causation to ALS, and those are important. Showing correlation and showing causation are two different things. So I think when it comes to being exposed to potentially pesticides, or even as in terms of petroleum, stuff like that, there is some research out there which just potentially show heavy metals and a elevated risk for ALS. But what we do with the registry is where we're actually looking at that with the specimens were collected, what we have already collected and will be collecting in the future, to do those testing for heavy metals, as well as organochlorines, pesticides, and so forth in the tissue and the blood of our patients. But those are very, very good questions. Right now, I don't believe you can say a pinpoint this is causing ALS, with the exception of the familial ALS conditions out there, to simply say this particular solvent or this particular pesticide is going to give you ALS. That's very, very hard to do when it comes to science as well as epidemiology.
Yeah, and just to add, the reason why is for environmental studies, it's really hard to get a definitive answer because you need a lot of people to have, like a huge N number, which means a lot of people to prove it. So that's why environmental studies are really tricky. So that's another reason we keep plugging the registry, but it's true. The registry has how many people registered?
Well, currently, we have almost 16,000 in the registry itself, so.
So those are the kind of numbers we need to pull out those environmental factors. And that's one of the big reasons why I think this was even approved, right? The registry to really pull out those environmental risk factors that we don't know about, in addition to a host of other things, correct?
Yeah, absolutely, because it's kind of going back to saying, if there was an exposure that occurred, one was an initial insult. Was it in childhood? Was it during a particular occupation? It's really hard to say. I'm not sure what your sister's occupation was, but the premise is that's where we want to go and solve this mystery by having individuals take our risk factor surveys, as well as giving us the information, simply saying, hey, so potentially, was this person, I give the example. So in our biorepository, we'll have a person who's potentially a plumber who was in the military, and we'll have their brain, and we can go ahead and analyze exactly what sort of exposures they may or may have had, throughout their life.
So I told you I'm a basic scientist and not a clinician, and I usually try to approach questions backwards. But my friend Luis came up with a theory which actually worked out pretty well, that lead's protective in ALS. And so we went and actually asked people at the NIHS to go look at the clinical data hard on ALS. And there's a weak correlation, depends how you measure lead and where, with increased lead and onset of the disease. And there's those weak associations, there's thousands of them. Mm-hmm. But actually the progression of the disease was slower if people had lead. And what we showed was one of the mechanisms by which lead works is it induces a growth factor called VEGF. And that was being induced in the astrocytes, and you could increase it. So we tried to publish it in a journal with the environmental epi paper, and we got rejected. It wasn't too surprising. We did publish it. But the other thing is, we were worried would people go out and start taking lead. It was like one dose would be enough to do you for a lifetime. Okay? But there are lots of things to look at that. What I'm trying to get at is the environmental factors. There can be positive, there can be negative, and it's very easy to try to blame the disease on something. And the disease probably started years before. And that's what makes this so hard and also so important, is to get long-term data where you can start to look at it in a much more detailed fashion. And even then, it's only going to be a clue, and you've got to figure out what are the downstream effects from it. Oh, and how much vitamin E? So it turns out it doesn't matter that much. 400 units is kind of what's recommended. What's important is to take it with a meal, and I probably would take omega-3 fatty acids too. You need to take it with a meal because it's a fat and it's only absorbed if you're eating a meal with fat. Otherwise, you're feeding your bacteria and your gut microbiome might be a little happier, okay? And it doesn't matter that you do it every day or religious about it because it's metabolized mostly in the liver and small amounts get into the brain. So it takes 2 to 5, 10 years to really build up levels in the brain to reach saturation, okay? And again, it's just a risk factor and it's an epidemiological factor, although the statistics for it are not bad.
Dr. Maida, it occurs to me that this might be a question you can't answer if you know the answer, so maybe Jill or Joe knows the answer. I read that funding for the registry was zeroed out in President Trump's proposed budget, and I was wondering if that's something to be concerned about, or are there enough members of Congress who care about ALS research that it's like an empty threat?
Sure. You are right. It was zeroed out with the president's proposed budget. However, what we are hearing is that Congress, the House, has restored the funding, and it's not going to be going to the Senate. I'm not a politician. I'm a scientist, so certainly it's one of those things. But I think there was certainly a built-up outpouring of support by the ALS Association, the chapters, patients, caregivers, as well as other partners as well, to go ahead and bring the attention to to the administration, to Congress, hey, this is certainly important research, but your question is correct, and it is currently zeroed out. There's no budget right now, but from what we're hearing, the House has restored it, and it's up to the Senate as well to go ahead and take care of it. So,
I think as a government employee, he's not allowed to say anything about might be politicking.
that is correct.
I'm technically a state employee, and they can go ahead and fire my ass, but you are extremely effective at contacting your representatives. Get any relatives out of the state to contact their representatives. And it doesn't take very many people to have a huge voice in government. So the advocacy that the ALS Association does is enormously effective. But it's amazing how few people actually get in contact with the government and the impact of being active is.
That's why we do our big conference every year in Washington, D.C., our National Advocacy Conference, because it puts everyone in front of the politicians to see this is happening, this is why it's so important. And if you look on our website, just so you know that there's a lot of great resources, and we try to make it easy for you and not a difficult thing to really reach out to your congressman or your senator.
Thank you, and thank you very much for being here. My other question was, what's next? We had to wait 22 years for Radcava. Do you have any idea of what might be the next drug down the road?
I mean, I think certainly, going forth, there are new clinical trials out there, whether it's tirasemtiv, whether it's NP001, whether it's the other ones which were also mentioned too. Stem cells is also on the horizon too. I think there's a lot of excitement when it comes to possible therapeutics for ALS. Radicava, I think, is only the start, in my personal opinion. So there are other things which should be coming to the forefront within the next 2 to 3 years. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, I agree. This is an exciting time in ALS research. With money from the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, things have been moving faster than ever, and we're really excited to see what's coming out soon. Just like you said, tirasemtiv, we'll know by, I think, the end of the year, phase 3 results. So that's something to look out for, and continued studies out of Europe, also with masitinib. Of course, copper ATSM, we're also excited about.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I'm biased. I've lived down in Corn Valley, and we're working on our own little things, but I've been watching this field for a long time. There's a huge number of things in the pipeline people are trying.
Yeah.
And dare I say, some of them are showing signs of working. So hope's important, but I think that this is actually realistic hope now.
I agree.
If I can concur in conclusion, as we finish up our afternoon, is that it is an exciting time for ALS. The effort towards finding a treatment for this disease is very much like a cumulative effort from person to person, year after year. It's like pushing water through the pipeline. All the people who've come before have helped move the needle, and all your work, particularly in public policy, every 2 years there's a new Congress. And oftentimes there's new members and there's new presidents who don't know anything about ALS, and we all have to do our part to educate them. Being part of the advocacy mission, coming with us to Washington, D.C., signing up to be an ALS advocate through the National ALS Association so that you get action alerts when important legislation is before Congress, so that you can know today is the day you pick up your phone and call, because those phone calls, Joe's exactly right, they make a big difference. When their phone lines clog, that's when they start to pay attention. We're very fortunate here in Oregon to have a very supportive legislative group of senators and representatives for most of our ALS missions and ALS causes, but it's a never-ending effort. It takes constant pressure and effort. In addition, the ALS research that's funded through the ALS Association is like a pipeline as well. We're excited to fund a lot of new and novel therapies that then attract larger funding from biotech, pharma, and private industry. But we have to be consistent in making sure that support is there on an ongoing basis, so that all these new and novel things that Joe and Jill and Paul have mentioned can then get picked up and taken to the next step. Because as Joe sort of mentioned, there's thousands of targets. The more genes that they identify, there's new mechanisms to investigate. The more they discover about the mechanism of how ALS work, the broader the field needs to become to investigate it. If you told us 10 years ago that we were talking about retroviruses, which is an entirely different field than a lot of ALS research, each one of these things is exciting, but it requires that ongoing support. From our local chapter, besides events like this, we're so proud to share that we've been able to, every year, on top of our normal contributions to our ALS Association membership, we've been able to make significant additional contributions to ALS research. This last year, $250,000. The year before that, $300,000. We're coming close in the last 6 years to funding more than $1 million of additional research just from all our efforts together here in Oregon. And that happens through the Walk to Defeat ALS. So I want to finish with my pitch, which is join us all at the upcoming Walks to Defeat ALS. Next weekend, Saturday, in Salem, the state capitol Walk to Defeat ALS. The following Sunday, the Willamette Valley Walk to Defeat ALS. There are some amazing team captains from that community here today, some of our top fundraisers who are supporting this mission. The following weekend, on the 23rd of September, the Portland Walk to or the Southwest Washington Walk to Defeat ALS in Vancouver, Washington, and then the 24th, downtown at the World Trade Center, the Portland Walk to Defeat ALS. We have forms to register. Cassie is standing over there. She can help you guys get signed up if you aren't already signed up. Your efforts, even one email to your friends to say, hey, I support this mission, I support this cause. It is the cumulative effort that pushes all this forward, because what we do as the ALS Association, we get no government or insurance dollars to do this. It's all our community pulling together. So you're the leaders, in terms of tapping into your support network in your community. You all make this possible. You make our ability to support these people and their work possible. It is really all of us on one team, and I'm excited right now for the state of ALS research and that there's potential new therapies in the future, but also really exciting and happy to have Dr. Maida here as well to talk about our understanding of what the causal pieces of ALS can be, because we want, our vision is a world without ALS. We want to treat ALS now and stop this disease so that everyone in this room can live a good life and live with ALS, but our vision is a world without ALS, and that means we want to prevent it. So I want to thank all of you guys for being here today. Let's thank all of our presenters. So I know they're going to be here for a little while, so if you have further questions you want to ask them, I know they'd be happy to talk with you some more. I also particularly want to thank our sponsors today, the Ability Center, who helps people across Oregon with adaptive transportation, Hayek Medical, who is a vendor with respiratory equipment and support and some new novel products that they have that you can see and learn more about. And then our longtime partner, ProMobile Mobility, who is a power wheelchair vendor and just amazing advocates for making sure that people have a good quality of life and accessibility in their lives. So thank all of you guys for being here, and we appreciate your time, and all of you online, we appreciate you tuning in today, and thank you for your support.